You have owners. They own you. They've long since bought and paid for the Senate, the Congress, the state houses, and city halls. They got the judges in their back pockets, and they own all the big media companies, so they control just about all of the news and information you get to hear. They got you by the balls. The table is tilted, folks. The game is rigged. They don't want a population of citizens capable of critical thinking. They don't want people who are smart enough to sit around the kitchen table and figure out how badly they're getting fucked by a system that threw them overboard 30 fucking years ago. You know what they want? They want obedient workers. Obedient workers. It's a big club, and you ain't in it.
There's a strategy that has been used by the owners of a nation for thousands of years. They use it because it is constant, it is effective, and it has been successful for time immemorial. The rich and powerful elite, the true owners of a nation, for a long time have used their control over a nation's currency in order to solidify their power, their control over the nation's government. This is because when you control the money supply of a nation, you control how that nation operates. You control which laws can be created by that nation's government. And this has been used to control kings. This has been used to control emperors. This has been used to control modern day governments, presidents and prime ministers all over the globe in order to ensure that the same rich and powerful families never lose their grip. If you go back in the records a few hundred years and look at the most powerful families, the richest families in that time, the same names pop up as today. You'll find names such as the Rockefellers, the Rothschilds, the Morgans. The same international bankers were operating back then that are operating today. This is because they have found the strategy. They have found what is effective, what works, and how to maintain that power and that control for generations to come. These families are careful about who they interact with, who they trade with, and who their own children marry into. Some of these families have actually cut off their children's inheritance because they married outside of what can be perceived as the modern day nobility. A small group of families that intermarry with each other to ensure that they spread the wealth amongst each other, but not with the common person, not with the peasants, the plebs. Many of these rich families, these owners, these international bankers, run their operation like gangsters, like the mafia. While they will sometimes war with each other, they are all out for the same goal. They'd rather fight with each other than fight with the whole world, which is why they will work together in order to ensure that their empires don't fall. How do you do this? There are a few different techniques, such as keeping the citizens fighting with each other so they don't peek behind the curtain and see who really is benefiting from their operations. But more than that, it's guaranteeing that you control the money supply in as many nations as possible, but more specifically in the most powerful, the richest nations. This is why many of these same families have financed central banks inside of the Western nations. Now, they have financed central banks all over the world, but the most important ones are the ones in the US and England, the Bank of England and the US Federal Reserve. The nation has to borrow from these central banks, and in the case of the US Federal Reserve, every single dollar that is loaned out has interest on it, which ensures that the US will never ever be able to get out of their debt unless they ended the Federal Reserve, which is why many has been advocating to end the Federal Reserve, because they see it for the con that it really is. For other nations, maybe they don't have as direct control over the money supply as they do in the US Federal Reserve, but they always make sure that they have an agent that is operating in those central banks to ensure that they know what's going on, what policies are being pushed by the government and those central banks. This allows them to stay in the loop, and by having an agent on the inside of these central banks, any policies that are being suggested that would harm them and their finances, they can ensure that there is pushback, and there's a good possibility that it won't actually ever come to light. the owners installed these agents into central banks all over the world, just like here in Canada, where the current governor of the Bank of Canada is Stephen S. Poloz, who is the current chair of the Bank of International Settlement Audit Committee, an international bank that is owned by the Rothschilds, by the Rockefellers. All of these international bankers have come together to create the Bank of International Settlements and the International Monetary Fund in order to control every aspect of the financial market, every aspect of the banking market. And he's not the only one. Stephen Poloz is not the first agent of the Rothschilds to be in this position. You look back at the board of directors and the past governors for the Bank of Canada, and you will see that just about every single one, if not every single one, has had ties to one of these banking dynasties. And this is the same for most, if not all, countries across the world. Do you think it's a coincidence? And in the Financial Post article, which we are about to read about digital currency, it was Stephen Poloz that was pushing for this radical change to the banking system in Canada. But we'll get into that in just a minute. But another reason that these same owners would rather have control over the money supply than have political control is simple. In the modern democracy, a government can be changed out every 4 years. This is why they do not go and try to achieve political power usually, because at any moment they can be voted out of that power. We can take the example of what ended up happening here in Canada back in 2015. After 9 years in power, the Conservative government of Prime Minister Stephen Harper was voted out for the Liberal government of the current Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Now, if these owners had only sought political power, they would have owned the country for 9 years, but eventually they would have lost everything when they were finally voted out of office by the Canadian people. There's a possibility they could rig the election, but when you own the money supply and you're able to pay off the politicians, it doesn't matter who's in charge of the country, which political party is in charge of the country, because you can own both. You can own the politicians, you can have them push the policies that you want. And the best part about it is you more or less remain anonymous. Sometimes your name might pop up in a lobbying document, but more than anything, you get to stand off to the side, let them deal with the brunt of the criticism, let them deal with all the paperwork, and all you gotta do is slide a few bucks their way every now and then, and you get what you want. Now, the one problem that the owners, the international bankers of our world have is the fact that there's all these different currencies with different monetary value. The American dollar is higher than the Canadian dollar. The pound sterling is higher than the Chinese yen. So the problem is this variation between all the world's different currencies. But what if you could create a currency, a one world currency if you want, that you could control, and better yet, what if you could make it digital so you knew exactly what people were spending their money on? See, that's the other form of control that a lot of the politicians, a lot of the owners of the country, the ruling class, that's another advantage that they have over the common man, is the access to information. Despite the fact that we live in the information age, when you have search engines such as Google or Bing or DuckDuckGo and social media platforms at your fingertips, there's only so much information that we can get our hands on, especially if it is being censored. There's only so much metadata that we can get our hands on. But for these people, it's not a problem. And when it comes to social media, the citizens, the peasantry, they put out all the information that they need to know, that the ruling class needs to know about us. But there's always one thing, one piece of information that has been sacred, that you don't just give out to governments, to people with money, and that has been banking information. And even the ruling class are limited about what sort of information, what sort of financial information they can get out of the peasantry. Now, what if they could change that? What if they could create a digital currency that allowed them to see what sort of money is being spent by anybody at any one time? Because it will leave behind a digital footprint, unlike cash, where they can see how much money you're taking out, but they don't actually know how much you're spending, where you're spending that money, what you are buying. But there's this push these days to end cash, end the physical use of money, and move all to debit, credit, and digital currencies. Now this, they can track your location, they can track what store you're in, they can track what you spent that money on, exactly how much money you spent on that item, down to the individual cent. And what if you not only could you create this digital currency, but you could in fact make it a one world currency? Well, this was something that was proposed by The Economist years ago. We're talking back to January 9th, 1988, where The Economist released on its cover a call for a one world currency. And The Economist is owned by the Rothschild banking dynasty. They've been waiting for this future to become a reality. While there's no official one world currency, one world digital currency yet, we've entered the age of Bitcoin and Ethereum, these cryptocurrencies. When it comes to Bitcoin, the creation of it is actually a little bit of a mystery. We don't actually know who it was that created the Bitcoin. When it comes to Bitcoin, all we know is that it was created by Satoshi Nakamoto, which is a pseudonym that was used by either the person or persons, multiple people, who developed Bitcoin. Now, Bitcoin at the moment is a decentralized currency, but this is being fought. This is being fought on all angles. We have the banks that are now trying to create their own cryptocurrency. We have Facebook, which is trying to unveil their Libra currency, their own version of cryptocurrency. And even the Bank of Canada has announced that they are exploring a digital currency in order to replace cash, and then they can track how people spend their money. This was reported on October 15th, 2019, in the Financial Post. In fact, the Bank of Canada called the decentralized Bitcoin a threat to the current banking system. As the Financial Post reported, an internal Bank of Canada presentation prepared by Governor Stephen Poloz and the bank's board of directors offers the most detailed public insight yet into the bank's thinking on a proprietary digital coin. According to the presentation, the currency would be widely available. It would initially coexist with coins and paper money, eventually replacing them completely. For me, one of the other dangers of a cryptocurrency that is owned by the government, by the international banks, is the fact that they can cut off your money supply whenever and there's nothing you can do about it. See, at the moment, they can freeze your bank account or end your bank account, as we've been seeing that's happening with Chase Bank recently. But what people can do to combat this is they can withdraw their cash from the bank, so that way, if it gets cut off, they have some fallback money. But with a digital currency, people could have their entire bank account, thousands of dollars, sometimes tens of thousands of dollars, frozen with no way to access it. This is a version of social engineering because it would encourage people to behave themselves, not to question the government or the international banking cartel, because if you do, you could have every source of income, every source of revenue cut off from you in a second, and it doesn't matter how much savings you have. As the Financial Post article goes on, it states, An additional payment method could make the payment system more robust, but the presentation notes digital currency also presents a risk to stable, low-cost funding for banks' deposits. And there it is. It is a threat to the banks, which is why they don't like it in its current form. They like it when they can control the money supply. As it stands, Bitcoin, Ethereum, and all of these cryptocurrencies are not controlled by them. So this is why they're going to try and make a digital currency that can combat Bitcoin. And you wait. They will eventually make it illegal for you to own any sort of digital or cryptocurrency that is not regulated by the banks or regulated by the government. As it continues, it suggests a digital currency would come with the option to pay interest on balances, the ability to collect more information on Canadians than is possible when people use cash. Quote, personal details not shared with payee, but could be shared with police or tax authorities, end quote, reads the presentation. It is not controlled by the bank's current cryptocurrency, so they need to gain control over it. They need to regulate it. And they need more information on how you spend your money, on what you are spending your money on, because it's a threat to them. This sort of thing will not sit well with the people. Do you remember just last year when people found out that Statistics Canada was trying to gain access to people's banking records? The outcry that ended up happening was deafening. The amount of people that did not want the government having access to their bank accounts. This is one rare occasion where, supposedly, the outcry of the people caused the government not to do something. Because it didn't matter whether you were on the left or whether you were on the right or whether you were in the center. Nobody wanted the government to have access to their personal banking records, their personal bank accounts. But now they're not going to give you a choice. What I think is going to happen, many of these bankers, many of these rich hedge fund billionaires are going to try and buy up Bitcoin as much as they can get their hands on. And then they're going to try and short it. They've done this before. They've done this before in many situations. A good example is when George Soros broke the Bank of England back in 1992, where he crashed the sterling pound. And then he did it again, just a few years later, back in 1997 during the Asian financial crisis. In terms of George Soros breaking the Bank of England, he made over $1 billion doing it. And he was not alone. Many other currency investors made a lot of money by crashing the sterling pound. They will do the same thing with Bitcoin. And when that happens, the only option for the average person to go to will be their government-approved, bank-regulated cryptocurrency, where they can see everything you spend your money on, they control all your information, they control how much money you have access to. And then, despite the fact this is just a number in a computer, nothing more, with no backing to it similar to the fiat currency of today, despite all that, they will charge you holding fees. A fee every single month for them to hold your number in their server. Just a few years ago, the idea of a one world government, a new world order, was nothing more than a wacky conspiracy theory. Since then, we have them admitting and calling for a one world government.
For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence, on infiltration instead of invasion, on subversion instead of elections, on intimidation instead of free choice, on guerrillas by night instead of armies by day. It is a system which has conscripted vast human and material resources into the building of a tightly knit, highly efficient machine that combines military, diplomatic, intelligence, economic, scientific, and political operations. Its preparations are concealed, not published. Its mistakes are buried, not headlined. Its dissenters are silenced, not praised. No expenditure is questioned, no rumor is printed, no secret is revealed.
We have before us the opportunity to forge for ourselves and for future generations a new world order, a world where the rule of law, not the law of the jungle, governs the conduct of nations. When we are successful, and we will be, we have a real chance at this new world order, an order in which a credible United Nations can use its peacekeeping role to fulfill the promise and vision of the UN's founders.
Since then, asking for governments and the people to hand over sovereignty of their nations to the United Nations, and over across the sea, the European Union.
That is needed, and that can only be achieved, and that is what I want to hear in this debate about the future of Europe, if we get rid of the unanimity rule. If all member states, and I think Romania is ready to do so, if we can get rid, and Romania is ready to do so, of this veto power, this veto right that all member states still cherish, but what is in fact the real obstacle to have a refundation of the European Union.
Since then, we have intelligence agencies and members of political governments in the US admitting that the deep state is real.
But there is something unique, you'd have to agree, that now the impeachment inquiry is underway, sparked by a complaint from someone within the intelligence community. It feeds the president's concern and often used term about a deep state being there to take him out.
Thank God for the deep state. I mean, I think, everyone here has seen this progression of diplomats and intelligence officers and White House people trooping up to Capitol Hill right now and saying, these are people who are doing their duty, who are responding to a higher call.
Well, it isn't a conspiracy theory anymore. And the amount of political authority that the EU and the UN holds over a country is shocking. Shocking that we allowed them to take so much from us and give nothing back. And now, they're coming after your money. They're coming after your money, and there's nothing we can do about it unless we act now. When they talk about a digital currency, you stand up and you say no. No more. We've given enough. They've taken everything. The last bastion, and we barely hold on to that we have as citizens is our private bank account. But they're coming for that too.